So this session of Teacher Tips is thinking about an approach that will promote oracy, again, classroom management, and paired work, which is think, pair, share. And I appreciate this for some people, this is not new. For some people, this will be new. But I wanted just to think really about this particular approach to teaching as one of many tools in your armory that you can draw upon to help support you in terms of your lesson delivery. And this particular approach could be really, really powerful if it's done properly. And as with anything in teaching, if it's done badly, it's done badly. And if it's done well, it's really done well. But kind of what is think, pair, share? Well, ultimately, it's seen as a cooperative approach where a whole class is given a question, a topic, an idea, ultimately to discuss, or a problem to discuss. And pupils consider the question, and they work individually to think about it, and then they work in pairs to think about it, and then they share their thoughts. So it's at its most simple, it's as straightforward as that you think in isolation, work in isolation, work as a pair, and then you share as a class. But if you take this approach purely at its absolute face value, there's a real danger that this can just fall apart, and it requires quite a lot of background thought and thinking to make think, pair, share work really, really well. And it can actually be equally a really effective classroom management approach as well. So why would we engage in think, pair, share? Ultimately, we want to try and promote within our pupils their knowledge, their retention of knowledge, their application of knowledge, their confidence, their ability to speak, to orate, and to have the confidence to speak out loud and share their thinking out loud with their peers, and obviously with the teacher, and most importantly. But also as an approach to support wider reading, writing, their memory and their attainment. This is an approach that has so many benefits for our pupils, again though, if it's done effectively. And I would argue that this can link really clearly to cold calling and no opt-out in that share stage, whereby you are getting everybody to give a response, some thoughts, some feedback, and that forces ultimately pupils to not opt out of having to engage with the learning. And I appreciate these are two distinct strategies in their own right, but they link really, really carefully, or should link really carefully, sorry, and really powerfully into think, pair, share as an approach. So when would you implement this? Because there's a danger that you could just be doing think, pair, share all of the time. I would argue that you need to have inputted some form of knowledge first and foremost that you're then looking to retrieve from the pupils. This isn't a case of a fofo whereby the pupils go and find out for themselves, create a multitude of misconceptions, and then feed those back. This is where you've actually engaged in some input, in some delivery, and you're trying to retrieve it. It's also an opportunity, or sorry, should form part of an opportunity to engage in some form of low stakes, low risk retrieval from the point of view of your teaching and learning, whereby again, pupils are drawing on something that you've already delivered, already taught, and they should be confident with. And that should again be part of building their confidence as well. But it's also an opportunity to get pupils to consider an array of viewpoints and stances and perspectives over a problem, a situation, an event, if whatever it might be in terms of your teaching, and to consider an array of views, because that can help them to consider how they might evaluate a particular problem. But again, they need the disciplinary knowledge to be able to do that. So how do we set this up? And this is perhaps the bit that requires, well, it is the bit, there's no way of getting around this. This is the bit that requires the thinking. So before your lesson itself, you need to consider kind of an open-ended question that you want the pupils to discuss. And you've got to think of a question that they can actually engage with. And I would argue that you need to spend, you know, at least a few minutes considering what your response or responses would be to that question. And if there's any misconceptions as well, you know, rabbit holes that the pupils might fall down before you actually just issue this into a lesson and get the pupils to engage with it. So it's really, really important to think really carefully about the question that you're going, or problem that you're going to get the pupils to consider as part of a think, pair, share activity. During the lesson itself, you need to introduce it quite carefully to the pupils as well. So some ideas to kind of help you in terms of the narration of this approach. You could use phrases such as, now we're going to talk about, now we're going to focus on, and because. Now I want you to try and define because. And then when pupils are engaged with the think, pair, share activity, so they're working in their pairs, you need to, I think you need to remind them, and certainly you want to front load this at the beginning, that they've got to be able to justify and prove the answers that they're going to give, the ideas that they're going to give, the solutions that they're going to give, the stances, with actual grounded knowledge. And again, this goes back to, you have to have taught them something before you can introduce this kind of approach in a lesson. But some considerations for you. Once you pose this question, you need the pupils to think, to really consider it on their own, and obviously then to promote them working in pairs, and promote them to disagree as well. Just because you've put two people together doesn't mean that they've got to agree in terms of their perspective. But all the way through this particular approach, whilst the discussion and the discourse that pupils should be engaging in is really powerful and really important, so is also making some notes around this in terms of trying to harness their ideas, and give the pupils really strict timings. So for example, you're going to have 3 minutes on your own now to think about problem X. You're then going to have 6 minutes as a pair to think about problem X. And then we're going to spend, and it might be that you don't articulate the time, but in your own head, you might think it's going to be 5 minutes to discuss as a class the share element of the think, pair, share. Now, once the class have discussed, you invite the pairings to share their responses, their thoughts, their viewpoints. And somewhere you need to be capturing these for the class so that they can then, if this is what your intended learning outcome is that they can then make notes in their own workbooks, exercise books, textbooks, whatever it is that you use as a class, those particular viewpoints and stances and perspectives, because we've got to capture that learning somewhere so that they've got a referral point, especially if this is an exam-based class at GCSE or A-level. The important point here is that perhaps we're trying to pull lots of different perspectives together. I'm going to go with my own bias now of being a history teacher as to why the First World War began. And we're trying to pull in an array of ideas that the pupils have discussed in their pairs. So it's pulling out kind of the key points. What I would recommend though here is that you pull together maybe a 4 or 5 bullet point list in advance of a lesson, ready to have to hand, that you can share with the class, because inevitably they probably will hone in on the points that you're hoping they'll hone in on, because this will be, again, an activity that will reinforce learning that has already taken place, as opposed to introducing brand new learning. But it's also important to consider your utilization. I know I've already said this, of cold calling and no opt-out. It's really important that you use affirmation and praise for the responses given, even if you think the responses are perhaps not as strong or as valid as you'd like them to be. Certainly throughout the whole of this particular activity, I wouldn't use a hands-up approach. I wouldn't promote hands-up anyway. I personally would use a cold calling approach all the time. But certainly for this type of activity, I would not promote a hands-up approach. And you need to really think through a way in which you capture the key points that are presented by the pupils. So the other element here to think about to influence your thinking is kind of a checklist before you engage in this type of activity, which is actually, do pupils possess the necessary knowledge to be able to make this to work? Have you ultimately delivered the relevant content to allow a think, pair, share activity to work? Is the question that you're setting open? Will it allow for discussion? Are the timings sufficient, punchy, pacey, appropriate? And there might be a degree of trial and error here to get this right. If there's tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary, do the pupils know this? Have they learnt it? Because if they haven't, they're going to struggle. Have you been clear from the outset what information you want capturing in their writing? Have you preempted any misconceptions that the pupils may well have? And is the question that you're setting them to discuss challenging enough? Because if it's a closed question, this is going to fall flat on its face within 5 seconds of asking them a class to do this, probably at the think stage before you even get to the pair stage. So they're just a series of considerations for you to really think about. And I talk about this particular approach in the Behaviour Manual, which is my book, which is available on Amazon and via John Catt. But I hope that gives you just some food for thought in and around how think, pair, share can work.